There are things a man does quietly that the rest of the world only understands years after he is gone. My grandfather was that kind of man. He didn't explain himself. He didn't sit you down and lay out his reasons the way some people do, spreading their logic across the kitchen table like a map. He just did what he believed was right, and he trusted the land to hold it until someone was ready to find it. He sealed Cave Hollow in the summer of 1987. I was 11 years old that August, and I watched him do it from the back of a flatbed truck. 2 workers from a concrete outfit in Cloverdale drove out to our property before sunrise and spent the better part of 2 days building a sealed door into the limestone face at the base of the eastern ridge. Steel reinforced, poured foundation, a lock, so heavy it looked like something off a ship. When they were done, my grandfather stood in front of it with his arms folded and stared at it for a long time. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, the way he did when something was finished and finished right. I asked him why. He looked at me with those gray eyes that had seen 100 seasons on this land, and he said the same thing he always said, when I asked questions the answers weren't ready for yet. When the time comes, Caleb, you'll know. He died 36 years later. And when his lawyer opened the will at the kitchen table of the farmhouse my grandfather built with his own hands, the farmhouse where I had lived and worked and poured my life into for 3 decades, the room went so quiet I could hear the elm tree moving outside the window. He had left Cave Hollow to the Cedarwood children's home, not to the family, not to me, not to my uncles who showed up in pressed shirts and polished shoes, acting like the farm was already theirs, to the orphanage, to a building full of children none of us had ever once mentioned by name. My Uncle Dale pushed back on the table, so hard his chair scraped a white line across the floor my grandfather had laid himself. And I just sat there, quiet, the way he had taught me to be. Because the truth is, I wasn't surprised. I just didn't understand yet. And understanding it would take a sealed cave, a geological survey from 1985, and a letter my grandfather had been writing to me since before I was old enough to read. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, because this story is about a lot more than a cave. Part 1. The Crisis in the HUL in Section 1. The Farmer's Silent World. The Harmon farm sits on 160 acres of hill country in the eastern part of the county, where the land folds and rises in long wooded ridges and the creeks run clear most of the year. My grandfather Ellis Harmon bought the first 80 acres in 1961 and added to it piece by piece over 2 decades, the way careful men build things slowly, without announcing themselves. He grew wheat on the lower fields and ran a small beef operation on the upper pasture. Later, when the margins on cattle got thin, he converted 2 of the lower fields to soybeans and leased the western timber to a woodland operation that harvested selectively, never clear-cut, the way he insisted. The farm never made anyone rich, but it sustained us. It was honest land, and he worked it honestly. I came to live on the farm when I was 7 years old. My parents had died the previous winter, both of them, in an accident on a 2-lane road outside of town that I don't like to think about even now. My grandfather drove to the county office himself to arrange the guardianship. I don't know what was said in that room. I only know that when he came out, he put his hand on top of my head and said, "You're coming home with me." And that was the end of that. I grew up on that farm the way plants grow, slowly, with deep roots I didn't know were forming until the wind tested them. I learned to read the soil before I learned long division. I knew which fields held moisture after a dry spell, and which ones drained fast and needed to be irrigated early. I knew the sound the elm tree made when a storm was coming from the northwest versus the northeast, a different pitch in the branches, a different pull in the air. My grandfather taught me these things without teaching them. He simply worked, and I watched, and eventually I worked beside him, and the knowledge transferred the way knowledge does on a farm, through the hands and the feet, and the long hours of doing rather than the short hours of saying. My uncles did not grow up this way. Dale was the eldest of my grandfather's 3 sons, and he left the farm for the city when he was 19 and never looked back. He was a property attorney now, with an office in the county seat, and a house that had a kitchen island and a 3-car garage. He came back to the farm twice a year, at Thanksgiving, sometimes Christmas, and he walked around the property with his hands in his pockets, nodding at things he no longer understood, offering suggestions he was not qualified to make. He had a daughter named Renee who worked in real estate development and who had a way of looking at the farmhouse as if she were already measuring it for something else. My other uncles, Gerald and Paul, had lives of varying distance from the land. Gerald ran a hardware store in a town 2 counties over. Paul had retired early on his wife's income and spent most of his time in Florida. Neither of them worked the farm. Neither of them had ever called during a drought to ask how the crops were doing, or during a hard frost to ask if the cattle had made it through. They showed up when there was something to receive. That was a pattern. My grandfather never complained about this. He watched his sons move away from everything he had built with a patience I have spent my adult life trying to understand and still can't fully reach. He told me once, on a cold November morning when we were repairing fence along the eastern ridge, that a man could only give his children what he had. He had given them the farm. What they chose to do with it after that was between them and God. "But you stayed," he said to me, not looking up from the fence wire. "That means something, Caleb. That means more than any of them know." I was 22 when he said that. I had been offered a scholarship to a technical college a year before and had turned it down without telling anyone, because I looked at my grandfather alone on 160 acres with arthritic hands and a hip that was already giving him trouble, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave him the way they had left him. The farm needed 2 people to run properly, and I was the only one who was going to be the second person. So I stayed. I stayed for 30 years. I worked the soybean fields and the wheat rotation, and managed the timber lease, and repaired the equipment, and drove the combine, and doctored the cattle, and fixed the fences after every winter, and painted the barn every 4 years, and hauled grain to the co-op, and argued with the co-op manager about pricing, and sat at the kitchen table going over the numbers with my grandfather in the evenings until numbers worked or close enough to work that we could sleep. And I loved every single day of it. Not because it was easy. It wasn't easy. Farming is the opposite of easy. It is waking before light and falling into bed after dark and watching things you work for get destroyed by weather and disease and market shifts that have nothing to do with your effort. It is uncertainty managed by routine, hope managed by patience, grief managed by getting up and going out to the fields anyway because the fields don't wait for grief. But there's something in that work that fills a person in ways that are hard to put into words. When I drove the combine along the southern field of harvest and watched the grain coming clean and heavy, grain that came from soil I had prepared and seed I had chosen, and whether I had watched and prayed over for months, I felt something that I have never felt anywhere else. Something like being exactly where I was supposed to be. My grandfather felt it too. I know because of what he told me in the last year of his life, when he was mostly in the house and I mostly ran things myself. He'd sit in his chair by the east window in the afternoons and watch the fields, and sometimes he'd say something that I'd carry with me for days afterward. "This land knows who worked it," he said once. "It keeps track, Caleb, even when people don't." I thought about Cave Hollow when he said that. I almost always did. The cave had been a source of quiet mystery for as long as I could remember. Before my grandfather sealed it, I had been inside it twice as a child. Short trips, just inside the mouth, where the limestone walls curved down into a darkness that smelled of cold earth and something old and mineral. The cave was deep. Anyone who stood at the entrance could feel that. The air that came up from inside, it was different from the outside air. Cooler, denser, carrying a faint hum that I used to imagine was the sound of something underground moving very slowly. After he sealed it, my grandfather never spoke about it directly. He referred to the eastern ridge in practical terms. The fence line up top needed checking each spring. The drainage culvert near the base needed clearing after heavy rains. But the sealed door at the base of the ridge might as well not have existed, for how often he acknowledged it, except once, about 5 years before he died. We were walking the fence line on a warm April afternoon, and I noticed the door was still solid. No rust on the hinges that mattered. The concrete foundation was intact. I mentioned it, casually, the way you mention something you've been wondering about for years without wanting to make a thing. He stopped walking. He looked at the door for a moment, then looked at me. "You know I grew up in the Cedarwood home," he said, "before your great-grandmother took me in." I didn't know. I had never known that. He had never mentioned it. He said it simply, without emotion, the way he said most things. He said he spent 3 years there as a boy, between the ages of 6 and 9, after his own parents died. He said it was a decent enough place, run by a woman named Ruth Carver who kept the children fed and made sure they had shoes in the winter, but that it was the uncertainty of it that stayed with him, the not knowing, the sense that your future was in someone else's hands, and those hands might not hold you. I always said I'd do something about that, he told me, when the time was right. Then he walked on, and we finished checking the fence, and he didn't say another word about the cave or the orphanage for the rest of his life. But I thought about it. I thought about it for 5 years. I turned it over in the back of my mind the way you turn a stone over and over in your hand, not examining it exactly, just feeling the weight of it, wondering what it means. When he died, I found out. Section 2. The toxic figure arrives. My grandfather died on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in his bed, the way he had lived, without making a scene about it. I had checked on him the night before, and he had seemed all right, tired but comfortable, and we had talked for a little while about the spring planting schedule, about which fields needed lime applied, and whether the weather window was going to cooperate. He fell asleep while I was talking, which wasn't unusual. I turned out the light and went to bed. By morning he was gone. The county coroner said it was his heart. His doctor said it was simply his time. I sat on the porch steps that morning and looked out at the fields for a long time without moving, and I thought, the land still has to be worked. Spring doesn't wait. That is the particular grief of farming. It does not give you a week. The wheat still needed attention. The equipment still needed to be prepped. I went out to the south field that afternoon and started working, because that is what he would have done, and it was the only way I knew how to honor him. The family arrived within the week. Dale drove up on a Thursday, which surprised me. I had expected him to wait for the formal reading of the will, which the attorney, a man named Franklin Marsh, who had handled my grandfather's affairs for 20 years, had scheduled for the following Saturday. But Dale never liked to be behind on information. He arrived in a silver sedan and walked into the farmhouse like he was inspecting a property he was already acquiring, which, I later understood, was exactly how he thought of it. He went through the rooms. Not rudely. Dale was never outwardly rude. It wasn't his style. But with that particular brand of professional assessment that property lawyers develop, the kind where they look at a door frame the way a doctor looks at an x-ray, he asked me questions about the lease agreements, about the co-op contracts, about the current market value of the timber. He asked these questions in a tone that implied he was simply gathering necessary information, but underneath the tone was something I had seen in Dale my whole life, the assumption that what my grandfather had built here was already his to manage. His daughter Renee arrived the following day with a leather portfolio and a tablet computer and a calm, practiced manner that I had always found more unsettling than Dale's directness. She was pleasant. She offered to make coffee. She asked how I was holding up with real seeming concern. And then, over that coffee, she mentioned that she had a colleague who specialized in agricultural land disposition, someone who had moved several family farm estates in the county over the past few years and gotten excellent prices. Of course, nothing needs to be decided right away, she said. Of course, I said. I watched her hands move over her tablet, and I thought about my grandfather's hands, rope-scarred, wide-palmed, permanently darkened to creases from 30 years of soil and oil and honest work. I thought about what those hands had built, and what hands like Renee's were designed to convert. Gerald arrived Friday with his wife. Paul flew in from Florida on Saturday morning, an hour before the reading was scheduled. My grandfather's 3 sons, assembled for the first time in years in the farmhouse he had built, moving through it with that particular kind of familiarity that people have with places they left. Enough memory to feel a home, not enough connection to understand what they were standing in. Franklin Marsh arrived at 10 in the morning with a leather briefcase and the deliberate calm of a man who had delivered news in farmhouse kitchens before and understood that the kitchen table was where the real weight landed. We sat around it, the 4 uncles, Renee, me, and Franklin, and the March light came to the window the same way it always had, and the elm tree moved outside the glass, and I thought about all the mornings I had sat at this table with my grandfather going over numbers, and I kept my hands flat on the wood and waited. Section 3. The public humiliation. Franklin read the will methodically. That was his style. He did not rush, did not editorialize, did not look up from the document to gauge reactions. He simply read. The farmhouse and the main 120 acres, the house, the barn, The fields, the equipment, the grain bins, the co-op contracts, and existing lease arrangements were to be divided equally among the three sons, Dale, Gerald, and Paul, each to receive an equal third share with Caleb, that is to say, with me, to retain a life estate on the property, meaning I could live on the farm and work it for the remainder of my life, but I held no ownership interest in the land itself. I had expected this arrangement. My grandfather and I had talked around it enough times that I understood his thinking. He wanted his sons to have the land he had worked. He wanted me to be able to stay on it. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair enough, and I had made my peace with it. Then Franklin turned the page. The eastern 40 acres, the ridge, the timber on it, the access road that ran along the creek to the base of the ridge, and the geological formation known locally as Cave Hollow, including all subsurface rights attached thereto, were to be conveyed in full and without condition to the Cedarwood Children's Home, a registered nonprofit organization operating in the county. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Dale said, "Say that again." Franklin said it again. Dale sat back in his chair. His jaw moved the way jaws move when the words forming inside him are being held back by effort and discipline. He was a lawyer. He knew how to not say the first thing he thought. But his hands on the table were pressed flat and white at the knuckles. "The orphanage," Renee said. Her voice was very level. "He left 40 acres and a sealed cave to an orphanage. That is what the document states," Franklin said. Gerald looked at Paul. Paul looked at the table. Nobody looked at me. "On what basis," Dale said, "does that bequest have legal standing?" "The eastern 40 was never separately deeded. It's part of the parcel." "It was separately deeded in March of 1987, Franklin said. He produced a copy of the deed from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "Ellis executed this conveyance 36 years ago. The transfer to Cedarwood Children's Home was completed at that time, held in trust pending his passing. The deed has been on record at the county office for 36 years. Another silence. Longer this time. Dale picked up the deed copy and looked at it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. I watched it happen. The slow, internal recalibration of a man who had come into a room certain of something and was now finding the floor under that certainty had gaps in it. "He left it to an orphanage 36 years ago and never told anyone," Gerald said. "He said it the way people state facts when the facts don't make sense yet. He told someone." Dale said. "He looked at me. Every person at that table looked at me. I held the look. I held it steady. I said, 'I found out the same time as you,' which was true. Technically, I had not known the specifics of what my grandfather had done. I had known he had a history with Cedarwood. I had known the cave was significant to him, but I had not known the legal details until Franklin read them aloud. Dale didn't believe me. I could see that, and it didn't matter. 'This is contestable,' he said to Franklin. 'It is your right to consult additional counsel,' Franklin said evenly. 'However, I should tell you that the conveyance was properly executed, witnessed, and recorded in full compliance with the laws of the state. The deed is valid. The bequest is valid. And Cedarwood Children's Home has been notified and has accepted.'" Renee set her coffee cup down very carefully on the table. The sound it made was small and precise. She said, "What's in the cave, Caleb?" I said I didn't know. She said, "You worked this farm for 30 years. You expect us to believe you never went into that cave." I said, "It's been sealed since I was 11 years old. The door is reinforced steel and concrete. How exactly would I have gone into it?" She had no answer for that, but the look she gave me said she was filing the question away for later. The reading concluded. Franklin gathered his documents with the same careful composure he had opened them with. My uncles moved to the living room and spoke in low, urgent voices. I stayed at the kitchen table alone for a while, looking at the elm through the window, letting the morning settle around me. What I felt was not what you might expect. I didn't feel vindicated or angry or small. I felt something closer to what I felt on the porch the morning my grandfather died, a kind of waiting, the sense that something was about to become clear that had been obscured for a long time. My grandfather had sealed that cave in 1987. He had transferred the deed to an orphanage in 1987. He had done these things deliberately, quietly, without explanation, the same way he did everything that mattered. The question was no longer whether the cave meant something. The question was what it meant. And I was the only one who had any chance of understanding that answer, because I was the only one who had been here long enough to know the man who put it there. Part 2, the masterclass article in Section 4, the investigation. The week after the will reading, Dale hired an attorney to review the deed and assess grounds for contestation. The attorney, whose name I never learned, came to the same conclusion Franklin had. The conveyance was airtight, executed properly in 1987, witnessed by 2 people, recorded at the county office, held in trust by a separate legal arrangement that insulated it from the estate entirely. There was nothing to challenge. The eastern 40 acres in Cave Hollow had belonged to Cedarwood Children's Home for 36 years. My grandfather had simply not told anyone. While Dale was pursuing that avenue, I was pursuing a different one. I drove to the county courthouse on a Wednesday morning and spent 4 hours in the records office going through everything that had been filed on the Harmon property between 1980 and 1990. The records clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy who had been in that office for decades and seemed to remember every document that had ever passed through her hands, helped me pull the relevant boxes without asking too many questions. What I found changed the shape of everything. In the fall of 1985, my grandfather had contracted a geological survey of the eastern ridge and the Cave Hollow Formation. The surveyor was a firm out of the state capital, a firm that specialized, I would later learn, in subsurface mineral assessment. They had spent 3 weeks on the property that October-November, and they had produced a report that ran to 47 pages. A copy of that report was on file with the county, because my grandfather had submitted it as part of an application for subsurface rights clarification, a legal process that formally established who held the rights to any minerals found below a given parcel of land. I sat at a reading table in the records office and went through that report page by page. The cave was not simply a cave. Cave Hollow was the mouth of an extensive limestone cavern system, one of the largest in the county, according to surveyors, who had mapped over 340 acres of underground formations extending from the cave mouth outward beneath the eastern ridge and beyond. The cave system was, by itself, a geological feature of significant scientific interest, but that was not why my grandfather had commissioned the survey. On page 23 of the report, the surveyors documented a mineral deposit in the deeper sections of the cave system. High-purity calcium carbonate formations, which held commercial value in certain industrial processes. More significantly, the phrase that stopped my reading entirely, they had identified surface indicators consistent with rare earth mineral concentrations in the limestone matrix underlying the eastern portion of the ridge. Rare earth minerals. In 1985, the market for those minerals was small and specialized. By the time I was sitting in that county records office in 2023, it was not small. It was not specialized. It was one of the most aggressively developing sectors in the global economy, driven by demand for batteries, electronics, and technologies that had not existed when my grandfather commissioned that survey. Deposits that were marginal in 1985 were potentially worth extraordinary sums in 2023. My grandfather had known. He had read that report in 1985. He had spent 2 years deciding what to do with what it told him. And then, in 1987, he had sealed the cave, not to hide it from the world forever, but to protect it, to hold it intact until the world was ready to understand its value. And he had put it in the hands of the people he trusted most to use that value rightly. Not his sons, who would have sold it before the month was out, but the children's home where he had once been a frightened, uncertain boy waiting to find out if the world had a place for him. I sat in that records office for a long time after I finished reading. Dorothy brought me a cup of coffee, without being asked. I thanked her. She nodded and went back to her desk. Outside the courthouse window, the main street of town moved through its ordinary Wednesday morning. People going in and out of the hardware store and the diner and the insurance office. Normal life, running along its normal tracks. Unaware that 40 acres of hill country on the east side of the county was sitting on top of something that had been waiting 36 years for someone to open the door. I thought about my grandfather standing in front of that sealed cave in the summer of 1987, looking at the steel door he had just had built, nodding once. The nod of a man who had done something complicated and difficult and right, and who intended to trust the land to hold it. It had held it. I made copies of every document in that file and drove home. That evening, I called the director of Cedarwood Children's Home. Her name was Joanna Tate, a woman in her late 50s who had run the home for over a decade and who answered the phone with a calm, steady voice that reminded me, in a way I hadn't expected, of my grandfather. I introduced myself and told her I thought there were things about the bequest she needed to understand before any decisions were made about the property. She listened. She asked careful, intelligent questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mr. Harmon, when would you like to meet?" If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. Section 5, The Solution. We opened the cave on a Saturday morning in late April, 6 weeks after the will reading. It had taken that long to arrange everything properly. Joanna Tate had contacted a geological consulting firm. The county had sent an official to witness the opening, a process required by the terms of the mineral rights application still on file from 1985. I had reached out to Franklin Marsh, who came as a legal observer, and Dale, who had found out about the opening through Gerald, who had heard it from someone at the county office, had insisted on attending. He showed up with Renee and their attorney, whose name I now knew was Roger Billings, a man with an expensive haircut and a briefcase that looked like it had never been near a farm before. They stood at the base of the eastern ridge in the cool April morning and looked at the sealed cave door and at the assembled group, the geologist, the county official, Joanna Tate, and 2 members of her board, Franklin and me, with a particular expression of people who are not sure what they are about to lose. I held the key. My grandfather had left it in a plain envelope in a lockbox where he kept important papers. It was a large, old-fashioned key, heavy in the hand, the kind that made you think of something being protected. On the envelope, he had written my name. Just my name. Nothing else. I stood in front of the door and put the key in the lock. The mechanism was stiff from decades of disuse, and I had to work it twice. But then something deep in the mechanism gave way with a solid clunk, and the door shifted on its hinges. Cold air came out first, a breath of deep, mineral-scented darkness that moved across our faces like a reminder that the earth keeps its own temperature down below and doesn't care about the season. It smelled of limestone and ancient water, and something clean and old that had no name in ordinary language. The geologist, whose name was Marcus Webb, stepped forward with a headlamp and surveying equipment. He looked at the cave mouth for a moment, then back at the assembled group. "I'll need about 2 hours for an initial assessment," he said. "Then I can tell you what you're working with." We waited. Dale walked the fence line with Roger Billings, their heads bent together in conversation. Renee stayed near the cave entrance, as a proximity to it might tell her something. Joanna Tate sat on a folding chair her assistant had brought and drank coffee from a thermos, patient and quiet. I leaned against a limestone face and looked out at the eastern fields, where the spring wheat was coming in green and clean, and I thought about 36 years of waiting, and whether the land had felt it, the long holding of this particular secret. Marcus Webb came out of the cave at the end of 2 hours with his laptop open, and a look on his face that people have when they've found something larger than they expected. He set the laptop on the hood of his truck and gathered everyone around it. "I'll give you the plain version," he said, which was a version everyone needed. "The cave system your grandfather sealed in 1987 is significantly larger than the entrance suggests. The surveyors in 1985 mapped approximately 340 acres of underground formation. Based on my initial readings, that estimate was conservative. We're looking at the largest intact limestone cavern system in this county, and possibly in this region." He paused. "Let that settle. The calcium carbonate formations in the deeper sections are commercially viable, but that's not the primary finding." He turned a laptop to show a topographic rendering from the 1985 survey, overlaid with his own morning's readings. The 1985 report identified rare earth mineral indicators in the limestone matrix underlying the eastern ridge. 48 species are found in limestone-associated formations. Several of those species have become strategically and commercially critical since 1985. My initial readings are consistent with the 1985 findings. I cannot give you extraction estimates today. We'd need a full survey, but I can tell you that these indicators are significant, not marginal. Significant. The silence that followed was total. Renee's hand had stopped moving over her tablet. Roger Billings was looking at the laptop screen with an expression that had moved past professional composure into something more. Genuinely stunned, Dale stood absolutely still with his arms at his sides, and for the first time in my memory, he did not look like a lawyer. He looked like a man. "Who holds the subsurface mineral rights?" he asked. His voice was very controlled. Franklin Marsh answered before Marcus Webb could. The subsurface rights were included in the 1987 conveyance to Cedarwood Children's Home. That is explicitly stated in the deed. Ellis Harmon transferred surface rights, subsurface rights, and all mineral extraction rights attached to the eastern 40 acres and the Cave Hollow Formation, including all underground extensions of that formation regardless of their lateral extent, to the Cedarwood Children's Home. Regardless of lateral extent, Roger Billings repeated slowly. He was looking at the topographic map. The cave system extends under neighboring parcels. The cave mouth, Franklin said, is on the eastern 40. The mineral rights are tied to the cave mouth under the terms of the conveyance. Your own firm could verify the statutory language. This is a well-established area of property law. Dale turned and looked at the sealed door, at the open door now, at the cold darkness inside it, and what Marcus Webb was telling him lived beyond that darkness. He knew, Dale said. He said it very quietly, not at anyone in particular. "Yes," I said. He looked at me. He knew in 1985 what was in there. I said. He commissioned the survey. He read the report. He spent 2 years figuring out what to do with it. And then in 1987, he sealed the door and transferred the rights to the one place he trusted to use them right. Joanna Tate stood up from her chair. She was a tall woman, and when she stood, she had a kind of quiet authority that the morning seemed to hold still for. "Mr. Harmon," she said, and she was speaking to me, not to Dale. "There's something else I think you should see." She reached into her bag and produced an envelope, old, yellowed at the edges. On the front, in my grandfather's handwriting, were 3 words. "For the family." This was in the legal file, she said. The one Ellis submitted to us when the trust was established in 1987. Our previous director kept it sealed per his instructions. He said it was to be opened when the cave was opened. She held it out to me. I took it. My hands were steady, but my chest was not. Section 6, the breakdown. I opened the envelope at the hood of Franklin's car, and I read the letter aloud. I read it slowly, the way you read something that deserves to be heard rather than scanned, and the April morning held its breath around us while I did. My grandfather's voice came through in every line, plain and direct, and carrying more weight per word than most people manage in paragraphs. To whoever is reading this, and I expect it will be Caleb, because Caleb is the one who stays. I sealed this cave because I knew what was in it, and I knew what my family would do with it. That is a hard thing for a father to write about his sons. But I have spent my life being honest with the land, and I intend to finish that way. Dale has been taking money from the cooperative account. The reading stopped. I stopped it myself, instinctively, because the silence that followed that sentence was so absolute that it seemed to need a moment to exist in. I looked up. Dale's face had gone the color of old ash. Renee was looking at him with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not calculation, not composure, but something raw and confused and young-looking. I continued reading. Not large amounts. Not enough to ruin anything. I don't think he even fully understood what he was doing. Taking from the cooperative margins, shaving percentages, the kind of thing a person tells themselves is a shortcut rather than a theft. I found it in the records 3 years ago. I never confronted him because I knew what confrontation would do, and I had already decided what I was going to do about the cave long before I found a discrepancy in the accounts. I am not leaving the cave away from the family as punishment. I want to be clear about that. I am leaving it to Cedarwood because it is the right thing to do. I grew up in that home. I know what it means to be a child with no floor under you. I know what it means to not know if the world has a place for you. I had a chance to give those children something that would hold them up for generations, and I took it. That is the beginning and the end of my reasoning. But I also want my family to understand something. This land has sustained us for 60 years because of the work that was put into it, not the ownership of it. The work. Caleb worked this. Land the way I worked it, with his whole self, without calculation, without asking what he would get for it. That is the only reason it is still standing. If you are angry today about what I have done with the cave, I would ask you to sit with that anger long enough to ask yourself what you contributed to the thing you feel entitled to. I am not a perfect man. I made choices that hurt people, including my sons, including this boy I raised when his parents were gone. But I tried to see clearly. And what I saw clearly at the end of all of it was that the land knows who worked it. Caleb, you already know what I want to say to you. You have always known. Just keep going. Ellis Harmon, 1987. The April morning was completely silent when I finished. A bird started calling somewhere in the tree line above the ridge, and the sound was so ordinary and so sudden that two people flinched. Dale sat down on the tailgate of Marcus Webb's truck. He sat down the way a man sits down when his legs have decided they've carried him far enough, and they're not going any further until something changes. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a long time. Renee stood beside him. She didn't touch him. She was looking at the ground. Her tablet was in her bag, and her portfolio was in her bag, and everything she had brought to assess and liquidate and professionally manage was put away, and she was just a person standing in a field in the morning. I want to be honest about what I felt watching this. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the satisfaction of a wound repaid. What I felt was something closer to grief. Not for myself, but for the distance between what my grandfather had wanted his family to be and what time and choice and a particular failure of not staying had made them. I thought about how much my grandfather had loved those three boys, how he had worked 60 years to build something worth passing on, how he had sat in his chair by the east window in his last years and looked at the fields, and what must have moved through him in those hours. Gerald was sitting on a folding chair with his hat in his hands. Paul had his back to all of us, looking toward the creek. After a while, Dale raised his head. His eyes were red. He was a man in his late 60s, and he looked, in that moment, much older. I didn't think of it as stealing, he said. Not to me. Not at anyone specifically. Just saying it, the way you say something you've been holding back a long time. I know, I said. That's worse, isn't it? I think he knew that too. I said, that's why he didn't confront you. He knew you hadn't decided to be dishonest. You just stopped paying attention. Dale looked at me for a long time. His jaw worked. He gave it to the orphanage. He said finally, the anger in his voice was gone. What was left was something quieter and harder to name. The particular flatness of a man who has realized he was seen completely and found wanting by the one person whose judgment he cared about. He gave it to the orphanage because it was right, I said, and because he knew you'd sell it. And because those kids needed a floor under them the way he once needed a floor under him, and he wanted someone to take care of it. You knew. I knew some of it. Not all of it. Not the accounts. He nodded slowly. Renee put her hand on his shoulder then, very gently, and he put his hand over hers, and for a moment they looked like what they actually were, a father and daughter who had come a long way for what this land asked them, and were standing on the edge of understanding that for the first time. Roger Billings quietly folded a document he'd been holding and put it in his briefcase. There was nothing left for him to do here. Part 3. Transformation in GST Section 7. The new stewardship. The weeks that follow were not simple. They never are. The geological firm came back and conducted a full survey of the cave system over 6 weeks in May and June. Their report confirmed Marcus Webb's initial assessment and went further. The rare earth mineral indicators were present throughout a significant portion of the underground formation. Commercial extraction was viable with appropriate permitting and infrastructure. A conservative estimate of the right's market value for a long-term extraction lease, which was the most responsible and most profitable approach, ran into figures that made Joanna Tate sit down when she heard them. The cave system would not make Cedarwood Children's Home wealthy in the way that word is typically understood. It would make them secure. For a very long time. It would mean a new building, full-time professional staff, educational programs, endowed beds that would exist for as long as the deposit held, and possibly longer. My grandfather had given 37 children a floor to stand on. Joanna Tate asked me to be part of the stewardship committee. a group that would oversee how Cedarwood managed the resource and the revenue. She asked because I knew the land, because I knew what my grandfather had intended, and, she said, because the children who had grown up in that home over the decades deserved to have someone involved in this who understood what it meant to be given a second chance by land that someone else had protected for you. I said yes. Dale asked to meet with me privately 2 weeks after the cave opening. We sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table with will had been read. The same one my grandfather and I had gone over the farm numbers on for 30 years. And Dale set a handwritten letter in front of me. He had written an accounting of the cooperative funds he had taken. Every amount, every date, going back 11 years. He had calculated interest. He had written a personal check to the farm estate for the full amount, which would be divided among the 3 brothers and eventually filtered into the estate's obligations. I don't know if this makes it right, he said. It makes it accounted for, I said. That's where it starts. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, I want to come back more often, to the farm. I know I don't have any standing to. I know it was never something I earned, but I want to understand what you and Dad built here, while I still can. I thought about that for a while before I answered. Spring planting starts in 6 weeks, I said. If you want to understand it, come out and work it. He looked at me like I had said something unexpected. Maybe I had. I'm 68 years old, Caleb. My grandfather worked until he was 83. I'll give you 10 years to catch up. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. The terms of the new arrangement were formalized over the following months. The Cedarwood Board engaged a mining rights law firm to negotiate a long-term extraction lease with an environmental management component. My grandfather had explicitly mentioned in his 1987 trust documentation that any future use of the cave system should include provisions for preserving the natural features accessible from the surface, including the cave mouth and the limestone formations in the upper section that were not part of the commercial deposit. He had not wanted the place stripped and hollowed. He had wanted it used with care. The lease terms honored that. The farm itself continued. I continued running it under the life estate arrangement, managing the main 120 acres the way I always had. Gerald expressed interest in buying Paul's share. He and his wife had been talking about slowing down, about getting back to land. And by the following spring, Gerald was making weekend trips out to help with the work. He wasn't a natural farmer. He was a hardware man. But he showed up and he worked, and showing up and working is the beginning of everything else. Renee did not come back to the farm. She called me once, about a month after the cave opening. She said she wanted me to know that she respected what my grandfather had done, and that she understood she had come there with the wrong frame of mind. She said she had been thinking about what kind of things she wanted to build in her life. Not monetize, not manage, but actually build. And she didn't have an answer yet, but she was asking the question. I told her that was enough. Asking the question was enough. She thanked me and hung up, and I stood in the kitchen holding the phone for a moment, and I thought, he would have been glad about that. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories.